All right, so today I'm delivering this talk, and in developing it, I did do a little bit of studying of what sort of the Armenian geopolitical situation is, and I expect that this talk might be a little controversial, given some probably closely held opinions, and that's fine. I'm happy to take any questions, challenge me, and I'm happy to go through it with you. But here today, we're going to be talking about cybersecurity at the global scale. What different nation-state capabilities exist. I'm going to profile 4 actors. I picked those because they tend to be the most prolific in terms of what we observe. And obviously, we investigate incidents that are not perpetrated by Western, especially U.S. Capabilities or nation-state actors. But I do know quite a bit about it. So if you want to ask questions about that, again, I'm happy to take them. So today's agenda, I'm going to do a little bit of a state of the industry just to kind of set the stage. We'll talk about where people are spending money and why they might need to be spending money differently to protect against themselves. We're going to go through, the capabilities of the different nation states, and perhaps know your enemy was a poorly chosen agenda topic for this talk. But then what we'll do is we're going to actually demo a kill chain where an adversary was able to gain initial access to a victim organization, pivot through the organization, and ultimately ended up wiping the organization with a tool called Ghost Wiper. And that should be interesting. I don't know how many guys in the audience have actually seen hack from end to end, but we'll show that. And then Q&A. Throughout this, please interrupt me if you've got questions. I'm happy to take whatever comes my way. And let's get going. So just a little bit about me. I've got about 25 years of experience in cybersecurity, mostly on the defensive side. I have done some offensive stuff, but really my career has been focused on security operations, incident response, things like that. I've built a lot of security operations centers for government organizations. I've run a couple of MSSPs where we had hundreds of customers and managed millions of devices. So even if you've got just general security operations or incident response questions, I can take them. All right, let's start with state of the industry. And I wanted to talk about this because what we've observed through quite a bit of studying is that the vast majority of spend in cybersecurity is on the reactive side, basically after the attack has been successful, and in response and recovering from sophisticated attacks. And I know this is kind of a lot of information on one slide, but really, this is the important stuff here. And so, our belief is that people need to become more proactive. You need to be doing things that prepare you for incidents and attacks, detecting them especially, and then ultimately you're going to reduce the amount of incident response and recovery that you're going to have to do. That's just again, state of the industry, where people are spending money and why. Why is generally because organizations are not yet mature enough to be able to actually be proactive. So they don't do the things like sophisticated threat intelligence. They don't do things like vulnerability management well. Most organizations don't do vulnerability management well. They may do things like the reactive side of the detective controls, like security operations center monitoring, where people catch alerts as things are happening, but very infrequently do they do proactive threat hunting, where they're looking for malicious actions in their environments, whether it's perpetrated by a cyber criminal or a nation state, and people need to do that. A little bit of some more scary kind of stuff. 93% of companies can be penetrated by cyber criminals. A concerted attack by a sophisticated red teamer or, again, an adversary like a nation state is going to be successful the vast majority of times. But penetrated by cyber criminals doesn't necessarily equate to a data breach, because if you can detect an adversary as they're progressing along their kill chain, you can stop it. And that's really what we need to be able to do, and that's really what my company focuses on. Also, related to the previous talk, 80% of nation-state attackers target government agencies. So that's really just saying nation states attack nation states, and really everybody does it. It's not always for the purpose of disrupting critical infrastructure or taking the power grid offline. The vast majority of time it's just simple data theft for espionage purposes. And one thing also to note is that nation states don't just use cyber security or cyber attacks to facilitate espionage. It's always a blend of traditional intelligence collection as well as cyber intelligence collection. And so you'll see intelligence operatives leverage both physical intelligence gathering with cyber tools. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we profile one of the nation states. So a little bit about, again, state of the industry, and a couple of things I want to call out here. This is detections by source, so who actually detected the attack. And unfortunately, 63% of the time, external sources are detecting attacks, and it's not actually the victims themselves. And I'd always like to ask the question why when we think about this stuff, and why I think relates back to that spend slide that I showed you earlier, where people are spending all their money on response and recovery and not enough on preparing for, preventing, and detecting attacks. And so external sources are telling them that they've been breached. External sources in this case might include managed security services providers, but very frequently it's law enforcement. Law enforcement would detect stolen data in somebody else's environment, or might observe an adversary that has breached an organization and uses their infrastructure as a launch pad to attack other organizations. And we see that very, very frequently. And if you, in my country, if you get a knock on the door by the FBI, it's probably something like that. So that happens all the time, and unfortunately, we're also not good at the time with which it takes to detect threats. So if you're not familiar with the term dwell time, it's really just how much time does it take to understand that you've been breached. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean people have completed their attack objective, whether that's stealing data or encrypting an environment for ransomware, but how long does it take to detect them? And I can tell you, personally, if I had 16 days of full access to an environment, I could steal every last bit of data from it, and certainly advanced actors have that same capability. So we have to draw that number down. It is simply not good enough. But one optimistic takeaway from this is that if you zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture, you're going to see that 10 years ago, it took us 400 plus days to detect a breach in our environment, and now we're down to 16. So that's a really positive trend. It means some of the money that we're spending on cybersecurity is working. I think it also means that the skills gap and the talent gap is closing, but the skills gap is one of the most significant things that we have to focus on in cybersecurity. There are not enough people that know how to do these jobs. And in my country, there are initiatives and basically government grants to try to close this gap. I'm not sure if that's the case here, but that goes a very long way. The younger people, the earlier we get to them and start training them, the better. So it's great to see some people here that are a little bit younger. Okay, so year over year, this year, phishing attacks are up from 11% to 23%. And this really, what this speaks to is what was the initial intrusion vector? How did the bad guy get in? It doesn't say anything about what the type of attack was pursuant to that, whether it was financially motivated or whether it was espionage motivated, but phishing was the number one. Last year, it was supply chain attacks. Supply chain attacks like SolarWinds. There were several others, and I talked a little bit about supply chain attacks yesterday, so I won't go too deep into that. But if you have questions about what a supply chain attack is, or if you want to understand some examples like Log4j, which was an enormous problem last year, we can dive into that. So again, this means that really phishing corresponds to the fact that we don't yet have the cyber skills that we need. People are not able to detect phishing, and so cyber awareness training needs to be improved, because if just one person gets phished, it could lead to an enormous problem. And I operate under the assumption that initial access is going to happen. Somebody's going to get phished, or some new 0-day is going to drop that we couldn't predict and we can't defend ourselves against, so bad guys are going to get in. What happens after they get in is the super important stuff. And I'll showcase that when we go through the demo a little bit later, because there are usually detection opportunities in any of these data breaches that if we had the proper controls in place to be able to detect threat actors, we could stop the vast majority of breaches. This is a slide that speaks to what was the initial intrusion vector by region. And there's a couple of takeaways from this that I found to be interesting. If you look at the west side of this, the initial infection vector was exploitation of vulnerable applications. That corresponds, I think, pretty directly to the huge number of 0-days that happened last year. It was actually a record year in terms of the number of 0-day exploits that hit the market. And when a 0-day happens, obviously, the organizations that might be vulnerable have to scramble, but there's probably not a patch available because it just hit the market. But there might be a publicly available exploit, or that exploit might just be held by the developers of it, who might be cyber criminals, but more often than not, they're nation states. It is usually costly to develop a 0-day, and so the more resourced organizations are typically the ones that do, and typically, again, it's nation states, but there are certainly very well-resourced cyber criminal operations, like ransomware groups, and I'll spend a little time also talking about ransomware groups a little bit later. On the East and the EMEA side, phishing was the number one. So again, I'm not sure why that is. I can't really intuit a reason for it, but I think it again speaks to perhaps a lesser degree of cyber knowledge generally across the population. So it's an area for improvement. And what I also found interesting was Asia-Pac, the most common intrusion vector was prior compromise. And as an incident responder, what that tells me is that those organizations didn't do the due diligence to understand how the threat actor that got in, how did they do that? And it's one of the most important things in incident response. You have to be able to figure out how they got in the first place to give you the opportunity to mitigate it. Otherwise, the bad guys are going to come back in. And I've worked intrusions, I've worked ransomware cases where we helped the organization get through it, but they were not prepared enough, didn't have logs that told us enough about the incident to go far enough back in time to understand what the actual intrusion vector was. So there was really no way we could help them mitigate, and they got ransomed again and again, 3 times in a couple of months. So that's scary, but ultimately it means, again, we need to be better prepared by improving our detection ability by logging better information. Any questions on any of this stuff as I go? No? Okay. All right, well, let's dive into the threat actor side of things here. So, when you think about threat actors, one of the things to really keep in mind is what is their motivation. There are different motivations for different purposes. Some are geopolitical, where it might be to serve the interests of a government, whether that be positive or negative, whether it be, again, espionage or disruption. And one thing I'll also say is often these motivations have some overlap, but they're distinct in what you would see in the actual attack based upon the motivation of the attack. And I'd say more often than not, the most common ones are financial and geopolitical. It might be obvious why, but with the financially motivated ones, there tend to be some kind of calling cards that you can identify in the middle of an attack about what they're trying to do. And when we see financially motivated incidents where something like a ransomware has happened or some other form of extortion, we have a better idea about how to go back in time, because there's usually a sequence of events that kind of is very a pattern that's recognizable in those type of incidents. Geopolitical might be a little bit different, and I will say the financially motivated ones tend to operate more quickly in a breach, whereas the geopolitically espionage-oriented actors tend to take a lot more time. They tend to really focus on operational security, and if you're not familiar with that term, it's just basically kind of closing your footprints, or basically trying to stay stealthy so that you can't be detected for a very long time. And there are very effective organizations at that. We'll talk about a couple in a few minutes here, but some of them are in environments for years. I worked a case I think in 2015 or so with a large medical device manufacturer, and when we identified the source of it, it ended up being a Chinese nation-state actor that had been in their environment for 3 years, and their purpose was effectively, again, the theft of intellectual property to support the Chinese economy and help them basically leapfrog from an R&D perspective medical device manufacturing. That's one of the key things that China does, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so let's dive into the Russian Federation. First off, I'll say as I go through this, there are more threat groups in each of these countries than what I'm going to go through here, but I'm really just talking about the most prolific. If you want to ask questions about other groups that might operate within these countries, I'm happy to answer them. But these 3 main ones are really significant, and they are, again, prolific in their exploits. APT-28 is GRU associated. GRU is Russia's foreign intelligence operation. It would be similar to our CIA. They've got a broad array of capabilities. They're also known as Fancy Bear. They use a variety of methodologies and malware. They include spear phishing in their attacks, watering holes, which if you're not familiar with that, it's basically setting up a website that might be of interest to a target individual, and that individual goes to that website, or perhaps conjoined with a phishing attack, goes to that website and is automatically owned. They're really good at doing that. They're also extremely capable with the respective exploitation of mobile platforms. So we see quite a lot of mobile-based attacks from this specific actor. And if you're wondering how do we attribute these attacks to these various different groups, it's complicated, I will say that. and it typically is the domain only of law enforcement and advanced threat intelligence providers that are able to identify clusters of activity that might correspond to common infrastructure that's used across multiple breaches, or it might include code base commonalities where we see similar code being used, similar exploits being used, similar techniques being used within a variety of breaches. But it takes quite a long time to attribute a single attack to a single threat actor, which is why often in threat intelligence we use something called UNCs, U-N-C, which is an uncategorized threat actor. And often we'll see, again, some similarities between UNCs and APTs, and that tends to come to a point where we can actually identify an UNC as one of these APT groups. Okay, APT-29 is actually one of the most advanced, and from my perspective, one of the most dangerous threat actors out there. They're responsible for quite a lot of really sophisticated breaches with really serious outcomes. For me, again, they're responsible for the attack on the U.S. Democratic National Committee, with which they were able to steal a huge amount of data that helped Donald Trump win the 2016 election. They also were responsible for a breach of the Republican National Committee's similar environment, but that data did not get leaked. So take what you will from that from a geopolitical standpoint. Again, espionage can be used to support interests of the nation, to support whatever it is they want to see happen. And that's a very good example of what can happen when a very advanced capability is brought to bear in the real world. They also have developed a wide array of custom tools, custom malware. They've got an extensive command and control network that actually includes compromised satellite infrastructure. So these guys have satellite infrastructure that supports their command and control, which is amazing. And one thing I will say is that while I can't, I'm not, I admire the capability. I can certainly respect the capability, but obviously, personally, I disagree with the outcomes of these guys. But they're extremely effective, and like I said, one of the most dangerous ones out there. That's APT-29. Like I said earlier, these guys demonstrate a very high regard for operational security, so they try to stay extremely stealthy, and they're in environments for a very long time before they attack, or actually accomplish whatever their objective was, whether that was data theft or something, more disruptive. And they definitely have done disruptive attacks. Turla, the next on the list here, is related to the FSB. The FSB obviously is local intelligence for Russia, so a lot of times we see the FSB targeting what we call near abroad targets, which would be countries that are closely located geographically to to Russia. So a lot of European attacks, a lot of attacks against China, which we don't hear about too much, but they definitely happen. But also we've seen Turla target individuals within Russia who might be dissenters, who might be journalists that they don't want, or they want to know what they know effectively. These guys also use infected thumb drives quite frequently. So again, that's a blend of traditional intelligence gathering and cyber intelligence gathering, where they might be able to walk a thumb drive into a location via physical penetration testing, plug the thumb drive in, and the environment gets owned. Or it could be somebody picked up a thumb drive from the ground, and I will say, if you ever see a thumb drive on the ground, leave it there. Don't pick it up. Or if you really want to know, and you have an environment where you can carefully evaluate what the thing's going to do that. Never plug it into your computer. A lot of custom developed malware for these guys too. And again, Russia is extremely capable. And again, I have to respect the capability, even though I disagree with the outcomes. Okay, let's talk about China. And one thing I will say, yeah, go ahead, please.
Simple question. So I wonder what has changed in the cybersecurity in USA that Russia could hack the elections of 2016, but couldn't hack the elections of 2020.
That's a very good question. I think in 2016, the DNC and the RNC certainly didn't take security as seriously as they very much should have, and individuals were targeted in both cases. The attack began, we know much more about the DNC side of things, but that attack began via a sophisticated phishing attack. So it was an attack on a person, not necessarily an attack on infrastructure. So I think we've gotten a lot better at detecting phishing attacks, and I think perhaps that initial intrusion vector map that I showed, that showed what was the most common intrusion vector for different countries, the shift from phishing to exploitation might be leading signal that we're getting better at understanding what are phishing attacks and what are not. But I'm not really sure. I mean, maybe in 2020, there was, well, I will say also, because of 2016, there was a lot of focus on ensuring that the election was secure, and a lot of money was spent on it in terms of like consultants and additional advanced tooling that would help protect them.
And this money was spent by the Republican government?
It would have been spent by each of the individual committees. And I will say those committees, the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee, are not part of the government. They're independent agencies, not even agencies, they're independent committees. So it's not like the government secured them, but the government did spend a ton of money on protecting elections. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, keep the questions coming, guys. All right, China. So one thing I'll say about China, and I only have 4 APT groups listed here, but there are dozens. They've got so many different groups that focus on different things, that have different capabilities. It would take an hour or more just to skim the surface on what these guys are capable of. But they have very advanced capabilities. And APT-1, we've been able to identify specifically the unit within the People's Liberation Army, and what directorate they operate under. If you've never read and you're interested in an intelligence report, there is a report that was written by a company called Mandiant, which is a partner of our company's, the APT-1 report. It's an incredible report, and if you want to have a really deep understanding of what these guys are capable of, because I'm not going to be able to do that in the time, read that report. It's a must read. It was the first APT group that was named, and it was named in 2013, and it was after an investigation to a series of intrusions that were focused on data theft specifically to support, again, Chinese interests, and use a wide array of custom tools, and again, like I said, they were the first named advanced persistent threat. Everything else you see here came after them. They're, like I said, all over the place all the time. It's not just against Western interests, it's against, they attack Russia, they attack, the Middle East, they even attack Africa because they've got a lot of investment in Africa and they want to understand what's happening there. Again, one of the most dangerous groups. I'd put them up there, equal or better than APT-29. APT-9 and APT-5, so first off, also, APT-9 is also known as Foxy Panda, and that's one thing within threat intelligence. You're going to find that threat actors, they have a bunch of different aliases, and so sometimes it can be challenging to understand who you're talking about. I just prefer the APT numbers because it's easier for me to remember than, Foxy Panda or Cozy Bear or something like that. I think also that kind of diminishes the threat. If we give them a name like, Foxy Panda, it doesn't sound very dangerous, but they are very dangerous. APT-9 and APT-5, they engage in operations where a wide variety of targets are identified. And what I found interesting is that these guys really focus on the defense industrial base, and specifically rotary winged aircraft and multispectral imaging systems for military and commercial use. And this is a good example of the motivations changing from actor to actor. This actor specifically is focused on improving the Chinese economy and the Chinese capability to develop things like rotary winged aircraft or multispectral imaging systems, and support of Chinese research and development. So they don't have to spend the money on research and development. They just steal it from somebody else and then basically copy paste their own stuff on it. That happens all the time. China is probably one of the most effective industrial espionage countries. I've worked cases where we've seen data being stolen that was obviously for the purpose of supporting again, Chinese economy. APT-5 is kind of a freelance group, but they have similar attack patterns, but they actually do conduct some financially motivated attacks to fund their operations. So I found that interesting, is that they seem to be a freelance group and not necessarily part of the Chinese government, but they work in support of the Chinese government. And that's an example of a nation state supporting cybercrime operations within their country. They're not the only ones that do that. Russia certainly does as well. I'll explain more about that when we get to the ransomware slides. But I always find it interesting when countries, freelance groups, that's not really something the US does. Not really. Yeah, but it's interesting when we see it happen. And APT-41 similarly was focused on basically espionage for the purpose of supporting, again, R&D within China. And I found it interesting. These guys actually stole a bunch of source code for video games and then also injected code in those video games. And when code injection happens, what that means basically is this piece of software that you're running, that you trust, has something malicious in it that even the developers of the software don't know about. That's called a supply chain attack. So basically attack the victim organization that's the software developer once, get your hack successful, and then you've owned everybody that uses that software. And there's some really good examples of where that's happened in the past. But again, sophisticated group. Then let's see, we can move on. Any other questions? No? Okay. APT-37, North Korea. So North Korea, very impoverished country. You might not think that they have a sophisticated cyber capability. You'd be dead wrong. They spend a huge amount of time and resources on developing cyber capabilities, and they're really good at certain things. What they're very good at doing is stealing money, and it's prolific what these guys are able to accomplish. They've stolen over $1 billion of currency directly. They target banks quite a lot. They also target cryptocurrency quite a lot. So if you ever see in the news a major cryptocurrency breach, chances are pretty damn good. It was one of the names on the screen here. They're very effective at doing that stuff. They also do target public and private sector geopolitical interests. A lot of it's focused on South Korea for probably obvious reasons, and Japan. But they do also focus on the West, so US, Europe, things like that. But more of their focus is on South Korea. APT-37 especially. They're very espionage focused, and they really are just focusing on South Korea specifically. APT-38, they're also known as the Lazarus Group, which is a name you may or may not have heard if you follow cybersecurity news. But these guys are damn good. And what they're characterized by is very long planning for their operations with extended periods of access. And what I mean is that they are in an environment for a very long time in order to complete their attack objective. And I worked one case where this group was in an environment for 155 days and stayed just totally stealth the entire time up until maybe a day or two before they actually completed their attack objective. So they're super stealthy. They like to be in their victim environments a long time. They steal money. They're fluent across multiple operating systems. They have a bunch of custom developed tools, and they constantly try to actually thwart the investigators by covering their tracks. So deleting logs and things like that, which make it super difficult for an incident responder to actually understand what happened. So these guys are really good, and again, steal a bunch of money. APT-43 is another espionage-focused group, but they are much more focused on the West than APT-37 is. They really don't focus on EMEA at all, or Asia-Pac. It's really just, well, it is EMEA and the North America and South America, mostly North America. What's interesting about these guys is that they create a bunch of spoofed personas, like fraudulent personas. So have you ever gotten a LinkedIn request or maybe a Facebook request from somebody that is just a little bit odd? You've got some kind of thing. It's usually a fraudulent persona that may have been developed by a nation state actor. It's not just cyber criminals that do that for scamming purposes. They do it for espionage purposes too. And they also cover their identities for purchasing operational tooling and infrastructure. So because North Korea is sanctioned, they cannot just go and purchase infrastructure from like Amazon, which a lot of nation states actually do. They have to create fraudulent identities to be able to do that. They actually do that all the time. And one thing I'll say, I mentioned this during the panel, but when you see these sanctioned countries that cannot really operate financially on the global scale, they've got to do something, right? And so a lot of times it's cybercrime that funds sanctioned governments. I see that continuing to increase. I don't think it's going away. I think it's only going to dramatically increase as we see more sanctions being placed on governments. And that doesn't just include the ones that I'm talking about here. I think other governments are potentially going to see that this is a very effective means of gaining money. And there really isn't an international consequence for it because there is no international law that focuses on this sort of stuff. And so you might see other countries leveraging a similar tactic. I actually think you might see terrorist organizations leveraging similar tactics if that's not already happening today. So groups like ISIS that have a ton of money, they may invest in cyber capabilities, and who knows what they could pull off, but I bet they'd be focused on disruption more so than espionage. All right, that's enough about China. Let's talk about Iran. So Iran also has a unique blend of espionage and financial motivations. And again, I think the why is fairly obvious. Sanctioned countries have to do something to make money. And so, cyber attacks seem to be very effective, and I almost can't blame them, right? So if you can't make money legitimately, you got to make money illicitly. Certainly don't agree with it, but I can totally understand why it's the case. APT-34 is largely focused on operations in the Middle East, so they spend a lot of time attacking countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, other geopolitical rivals. But one way or another, basically a lot of their targeting is in that location. A few attacks, not many, on North America and European organizations. Very effective group, and again, they are able to develop custom tools. We assess that they're maybe a little bit less sophisticated than some of the Chinese and Russian actors that I've talked about, but that's definitely not going to last forever. They'll get better over time for sure. And then AP-35, this is a strategic intelligence operation that typically targets the West, but some Middle East as well. And from October through 2020 through October 2021, what again I found interesting is that a really significant portion of APT-43's activity targeted healthcare and pharmaceutical companies, and I think that's mostly in response to support of COVID-19 vaccine development. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be espionage for bad purposes. If they couldn't get vaccines any other way, then I kind of can't blame them, right? One way or another, that's one thing that we observed happening. So APT-42, they're an information collection organization, but they also perform a lot of surveillance against individuals and organizations that they disagree with. So this might be internal dissenters, again, it might be journalists. They use mobile spyware, so probably Pegasus and stuff like that. But they're capable of tracking victim locations very closely using again, a tool like Pegasus, and even collecting phone conversations, SMS. So one thing about them, their operations are designed to build trust and rapport with their victims. So they tend to be sophisticated, like human interaction operations. So again, it's a form of phishing, but it's often in person. So again, a blend of traditional intelligence gathering and cyber intelligence gathering. All right, we can talk about ransomware now, because I think no talk about global threats can't include ransomware these days. And so this slide is a depiction of what the ransomware ecosystem looks like. And ransomware as a service is a way that which the different ransomware operators have achieved scale. They're able to steal billions of dollars or extort billions of dollars. There are individual ransomware groups that have made literally billions of dollars. What's notable about that is it's not just one person doing it. Usually there's a whole collective community around the different named ransomware groups that you might be familiar with, some of which are named on the screen here that are currently pretty prolific. But what often happens is you've got sort of the main team that has developed the actual ransomware, and they lease it out to what are called affiliates. And they may have 5 affiliates, they may have 20 affiliates. And those affiliates are the ones that actually perform the attacks. A couple of notes about the affiliate organizations and really how these organizations operate. So they mostly communicate on dark web forums that are very strictly controlled from an access standpoint. And one of the prerequisites is Russian speaking. They will only accept Russian speaking people. And we've observed that a lot through human intelligence gathering. So they also, the ransomware, thing to note, when we decompile, a significant percentage of it also will not run on systems that are configured with Russian as the default language. So do the math on that. The other thing to note here is that the affiliate themselves might not be the one that broke in. What often happens is they simply buy access from what are called initial access brokers. So these are bad guys that basically are attacking anybody in the world, and through typically using something like Shodan to understand who's vulnerable to a new zero-day exploit. They'll exploit it, break in, and then sell that access along to somebody else to do whatever they want with it. Happens again on those same dark web forums, and the access might be sold for $3,000 or it might be sold for $50,000. And that really depends upon the type of company that they've breached, how big they are, how much money they make, stuff, or how sensitive the data is that they have. And that all factors into how valuable that access is to the ransomware operators. Because ransomware operators, they operate like a business. And if you've ever thought of like the sales funnel, ransomware operates the same exact way. So there's a huge top of funnel of people that might be potentially ransomable, which to push them down the funnel, funnel, they understand basically the profile of the organization. Is it worth it for us to spend the time going after these guys? Is the amount of money that we're going to make from them worth the exercise? And the fact that they have scaled through the affiliate organizations means that a lot of them, for a lot of them, they're going to say, yeah, it is worth it. But often they will kind of kick out of the funnel the small organizations because they're simply not going to have things like cyber insurance or enough money to pay a large enough ransom to make it worth their while. But you'll note also the specialists that are attacking the victim organizations too. Within these organizations, they tend to be a team, but in some cases that might be one person, but in a lot of cases it's multiple people because there are certain things that have to happen in the middle of a ransomware attack in order for it to be successful. Typically, initial access is not going to be sufficiently elevated privilege. They're not going to be like domain admin right off the bat. So they've got to do things like privilege escalate. They've got to do things like lateral movement. They've got to do things like maintaining persistence. And they've got to do things like compromising domain controllers in order for a ransomware operation to be really effective. The demo I'm going to show you is actually going to look really similar to how ransomware attacks actually happen. But again, I know this might be unpopular, but there are some geopolitical implications that I just can't not talk about. If nearly all of these syndicates are Russian-speaking only and will only accept Russian-speaking operators, that says a lot to me. And the other thing, like I said, most common ransomware strains will not execute when Russian language is the default setting. So if you want to protect yourself from ransomware and you speak Russian, you might want to set that to your default setting. I don't, so I'm unfortunately vulnerable to this, but perhaps you guys are not. Also, though, Russia has, I think, no interest in attacking you guys with ransomware, but these are cyber criminals. So just think about that again. That funnel concept that I mentioned. If you're valuable enough to be attacked, you might be on the wrong side of it. When I think this through, we've got all of these Russian operators operating within the boundaries of the Russian Federation, and Russia doesn't do anything about it. When we can actually identify people, which we have, and issued indictments for them, Russia certainly doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States, so there's simply nothing we can do about it. And so ransomware operators almost never actually face consequences. And I say almost never because it has happened a few times. And the way it happens is following the money. I investigated about 100 ransomware incidents over the course of 2020, and a significant percentage of them were the group NetWalker. And we were able to, because so many organizations had to pay the ransom, we were able to provide law enforcement the Bitcoin addresses that were used in these various different operations. And through, again, following the money, they were able to identify a set of operators, one of which was in Canada. And so Canada extradited him to the United States, and we actually shut down NetWalker. That's one of the few success stories as it relates to ransomware, because we often can't do that. But when organizations like ransomware groups get shut down, it doesn't mean they're gone. It means they've rebranded. And so you can see organizations like Ryuk turn into Conti, and then Conti turn into Black Basta, or Lockbit, and Lockbit turn into Lockbit 2.0. And it's a rebranding exercise most of the time. It's often the same operators that are just using different tool and maybe have enhanced the malware a little bit. And the way we can determine that is, first off, again, analyzing Bitcoin addresses, and then analyzing the code itself, because there's very frequently sort of traces of the ransomware's lineage, so we can tell where it came from and where it was developed. But again, I think if these organizations really only focus on Western countries, that's in Russia's interest, right, geopolitically. So that, I think, speaks to me that they turn a blind eye to it because it's ultimately in their interest. And I also believe, this is speculation, and really, all of this is speculation, it's not proven, but I do believe that effectively ransomware proceeds are taxed, and some of that is used to fund Russian operations. But one other thing, when major ransomware attacks happen, they're super, super high profile. And there's one good example in the US, which was the Colonial Pipeline attack, which was perpetrated by REvil. I don't know if that made the news here or not, but basically the entire eastern seaboard of the United States was shut down from a gasoline delivery standpoint. So we had major spikes in gas prices, and people just couldn't get gas. And it was so high profile, the president made a lot of commentary on it, and it was very tense between Russia and the United States at that time. So what we observed after that was the victimology changing a little bit, where the ransomware groups would openly state on their blogs that they're not going to go after critical infrastructure, they're not going to go after healthcare, stuff like that. But I can tell you, again, in 2020, during the pandemic, I worked a hell of a lot of incidents where it was hospitals, where it was children's hospitals, where it was radiology clinics and things like that. And I personally found that to be absolutely deplorable. In the middle of a pandemic, you're going to stop people from getting medical care. You're actually putting lives at risk. So I don't have a lot of respect for the ransomware guys. Any questions on that? No? Okay. Why don't we switch to the kill chain demo, because I think you guys are going to find this interesting, or I hope at least you will. And I'm going to use my platform for this, but one thing I'll say is that we have an open source version of this platform, and if anybody would like to log into it, it's just app.snapattack.com. You know what I'm going to do is just switch to screen mirroring so I can do this from here. It's, I think, going to be a little bit easier for me. Where'd it go? Okay. So just give me 1 second, guys. Okay, yeah, there we go. All right, hope I'm logged in. I'm going to search for APT29, the one we talked about, and we're going to go to a threat actor page. And on this page, we can learn more about this threat actor. And the internet's kind of slow, so this might not be the best demo. But what we try to do is identify, who the actor is, what are their different aliases, what different tools do they use, what different MITRE attack techniques do they use, and each of these you can click into to get some better understanding about what it is. This isn't a commercial, but again, there's an open source version of this that you can get for free and get a heck of a lot of information about a wide variety of threat actors. So what I wanted to do was show you a couple of things. And actually, what I'm going to do is filter this down for Felina. And Felina, if you're not familiar with it, was a Windows 0 day that came out in June of last year and created hundreds, thousands, definitely, probably tens of thousands of incidents. I worked probably 20, but I'm one guy. So we wanted to dig into this a little bit, and so we collected some intelligence about it. And one thing we observed is this report from a company called Mandiant, which we have a partnership with, that showed a Russia-linked APT, which we believe to be APT29 because they are the military intelligence arm of Russia, targeting Ukraine by exploiting this Felina vulnerability. And so what we do is we take intelligence and we use offensive researchers to emulate the activity that we learn about in intelligence, and we record it. So what is shown here is a kill chain where Felina was the initial intrusion vector. And again, think about initial intrusion vectors. This is a blend of both a phishing attack and an exploit of a 0-day. And so if we scroll down a little bit here, we can kind of watch this unfold. And we're looking at this from the adversary's perspective right now. What they are doing currently is staging a spear phishing attack against this victim, which there might not be video playing for yet. There is. This victim is going to get phished. They did not pay attention to security awareness training, unfortunately. They're going to, in a couple of seconds here, if I press play, they're going to open a malicious document that's been poisoned with the Felina vulnerability. And what's interesting is that from this victim perspective, nothing else happens. They just opened a Word document. Everything else that happens is completely under the covers because, again, APT29 focuses on stealth. So it's better to actually look from the bad guy's perspective. And what you're going to see across the bottom of this timeline, these red stars are actually the moments of attack. And so first off, we see the spear phishing Word document. And what happens just after that user gets phished is the actual, the Felina exploit occurs, and we can actually observe that happen, what actually happens when it happens. What Felina grants to you is what's called remote code execution. So at this point in time, the adversary has the ability to execute code on the victim machine. And so what they do is set up a command and control infrastructure. And I'm going to pause it there because I want to say one thing about this. APT29 doesn't use tools like Sliver. Sliver is open source. APT29 develops their own custom command and control infrastructure that leverages satellites. I mentioned that earlier, but that would have been the command and control infrastructure of this attack. Sliver is analogous to how they would have done this. Then once an adversary gets into an environment, like I mentioned earlier, it's not like they immediately get the ransomware deployed. There are several steps that they have to take in order to be effectively enough privileged to actually execute things like ransomware or ghost wipers. In this case, what the user is doing, or the adversary is doing, is using a command called "Who am I?" To understand their current security context and realize that they're just a regular old user. So the very next thing that they're going to have to do, and they also do a little bit of recon about their current environment and what's on the box and things like that, which always happens as well. And what they're ultimately going to need to do is escalate privileges. And so they use an exploit called FOD helper. FOD helper is a user account control bypass, which basically bypasses the user account controls that are built into Windows, which allows them to immediately escalate their privileges. It only grants you local system security context, your only local system. And what that means is basically they can only be administrator on the victim box that they're on. They don't have administrator on the rest of the environment yet, and that's a requirement for an effective attack. So they're going to start doing things like reconning the rest of the environment, trying to understand where domain controller infrastructure is, because ultimately what they need to do is get over to this domain controller, get local access to it, and then get domain administrator access to it. And so we can watch them do that. If we look again back at the attacker perspective, they're doing a couple of things around, again, basically just looking around the environment, trying a couple of things, trying who am I again to see who they are. And you see after FOD helper ran, they now have NT authority system, which means they have, again, administrator access on this local box. But that's not good enough. So what they need to do is find a way, well, first off, actually maintain persistence. So what persistence means is the bad guy wants to be on this box even if the victim reboots. And so what happened here is a scheduled task. A scheduled task is something that's going to happen at a time that you basically write into the group policy objects of a Windows machine. In this case, it was a scheduled task that basically executed the command and control stuff that happened earlier in the kill chain upon boot. So just right upon booting the machine, they would have that beacon back to them saying, okay, things back online, I can get back in there and continue doing my job. That's a very common thing in attacks because effectively if you turn off the box, you've got the bad guy out in some cases, not in every case, but in this case they used scheduled tasks. And there are other means of gaining persistence, but that's what was used in this case. So if we persist here, if we keep going down this timeline, we're going to see them start doing things like looking at the different user accounts on the system and trying to understand if there's somebody in there that might have domain admin access or administrator access on a different machine in the environment. And so what they're going to do is use a tool called Mimikatz, which you might be familiar with, to dump LSAS. LSAS is Local System Authority Source Service or subsystem, and it's basically where all of the credentials are stored in your memory. And there are certain ways to dump credentials out of memory. Mimikatz is one that's used quite frequently, but it's not the only one. And basically what it does is it pulls all of the contents of LSAS out of it and puts it in a file that's going to be available to the adversary at this point. And they have two choices. In some cases, there might be some unencrypted passwords in the memory store. Not in every case, but in some cases there are. What they could also do is just take that file that was generated and pull it off of this box and run password crackers against it. And that's what we did in this case. So we pulled this out of the box, ran password crackers against it. And in often cases, password management is not good. People write sloppy passwords. And it took seconds in this case to just crack a password that looked like it would work. That's very frequently the case. There are other ways that they might go about doing this, but this was the most effective for us. So at this point now, they've got, again, local system access on the machine itself, and they've got credentials for other accounts that have logged into that machine. And when you think about that, when you've got a local box, who else is going to be logging into that machine? Often it's going to be systems administrators of the organization. So here they've captured system administrator account credentials that they can use to do other bad things. And so they're going to do a little bit more reconnaissance, and I'm not sure why my timeline's not working, reconnaissance around the network to see where they can laterally move. And again, they're trying to hit the domain controller. So they use a tool called Certified. which gives them a machine account on a different machine. And again, basically that just means they have system level access on a different machine. In this case, it's the domain controller. So what they get to do now is jump over to the domain controller and effectively they're interacting with that at an administrator level. And so they grab what's called a ticket granting ticket, which in Active Directory administration means it's basically game over at this point. They can do a lot of different bad things with respect to like creating accounts that are significantly privileged. So often they'll create a new account and use that account to further the rest of the operation because they don't want to necessarily use an existing account and maybe set up some triggers because they're doing things that are not the anomalous behaviors to what that user might do. But once they've got a ticket granting ticket, again, it's almost game over, but they're going to want to embed themselves further into the domain controller. So they dump all of the secrets. And basically they used a different strategy to get all of the passwords off of this domain controller. And so at this point, again, they've got keys to the kingdom, right? They can do whatever they want. And so at the end of this, they use a tool called Impacket to basically reuse the admin hash. So this is what's called a hash replay attack, where they basically just replayed the hash into the place it needed to be, and then ultimately it let them do what they wanted to do. And then again, they needed to stay persistent on the domain controller. So they installed a sliver agent. So again, that's the command and control. Again, in this case, that would have been APT29 specific command and control infrastructure, not sliver, but it looks really similar. So at this point in time, they've got domain admin access, they've got every password in the environment, and what frequently happens, and in fact in this case it did, what they did was they created a group policy object, and again if you're not familiar with Windows Domain Administration, a group policy object is basically the policy that every computer in that environment runs, and so they created a malicious group policy object which basically upon login for the other machines in the environment, it downloaded Ghostwiper and ran it. So in a handful of minutes, they were able to just completely wipe this environment, and there really was no going back from there. Completely wiped environment. So difficult one to investigate, but again, we didn't have Ghostwiper, so we couldn't execute that. But I will say one thing, before we come away from this, is that this pattern that you're observing here is extremely common, and it's based upon whatever the attack objective is, whether that be again data theft, whether that be ransomware, whether that be destruction, like what happened here, a very, very common attack pattern. Yeah, go ahead.
And is this a common pattern also for Linux systems?
Yeah, it would be similar. They'd be using different tools, but it would be...
There's no big difference between Windows and Linux.
I mean, there are huge differences between Windows and Linux, but I think... there are. I think there are far more advanced tools that operate on Windows machines because there are fewer Linux systems, but you still do have security controls in Linux that can be abused and in similar ways. So just because you run Linux doesn't mean you're invulnerable. I think that's the answer to the question. Okay, so like I said, this could have been a ransomware attack. This could have been data theft. In this case, it was destruction. But again, you're going to see a very frequent pattern of events that inside an incident, starting with initial access, laying down command and control, escalating privileges, attempting to get persistence, obtaining the rest of the credentials in the environment, laterally moving to the domain controller, getting a ticket granting ticket from the domain controller. Again, it might not necessarily be a ticket granting ticket. They might just go directly to domain admin. But in this case, what this gives them is the ability to create new accounts. And basically, this is another means of persistence because once you've got the ticket granting ticket, you have to do a very particular sequence of events to recover from that, and a lot of administrators don't even know how to do it. So that's an effective way for persistence. And then getting the rest of the secrets, getting the admin on the domain controller, and maintaining persistence on the domain controller. Very, very common pattern of events. And what I like to say about this is that each of those red stars is a detection opportunity. This could have been stopped if we were able to detect the activity. So that's why when I think about where people are spending their money in cybersecurity and saying it's in the wrong place, because they waited till the very end until they got wiped or until the ransomware ran and they've got a ransomware node on their desktop to fucking do anything about it. If they spent more time putting focus to detection, this would never have happened. And there are means of actually detecting the activity. So I find it unfortunate that these kind of things still happen in today. All right, I think I only have a couple of minutes left. There are a few other slides, but I'm happy to just take questions instead if anybody has some. Yeah.
So in that case, you talked about, was he using some zero day? You talked about the zero day in Microsoft Word. What was the key?
Yeah, you're asking what was the 0 day? So it was called Folina, and basically what it is Windows Office applications like Microsoft Word or Excel were able to spawn child processes of the Microsoft diagnostic tool. And if you want to take a look at exactly what that looks like, I can show you. Let's see, where is it? Oops, on my timeline, I think it's 54. All right, so here's the Folina attack, and if we want, we can look at this on the process graph. Again, this is accessible to you guys, so if you want to dig into it, feel free. But we can see exactly what happened here, and hopefully this loads quickly, because I know I've only got a couple of minutes left here. Okay, all right, so this is the process graph, and the exploit is Windows, Word in this case. It could be Excel, it could be PowerPoint, it could be any other Office application, spawning the Microsoft diagnostic tool, which is suspicious in and of itself, but if you pass it certain command parameters, it granted you remote code access, and the command parameters were encased in the command line. And so if you want to see what those look like, we can pull that target log into this detection builder. And what we were looking for here, again, it was pretty obvious on the prior screen. We've got a parent process of WinWord looking for a child process of Microsoft Diagnostic Tool, but the command line is important, so we need to include it. Unfortunately, what I just did is actually overtuned that rule. It's too specific, so I've got to get a little bit more clever. And again, I've read the threat intelligence reports on this, so I know what I'm looking for, but you would need to do a little bit of research. And then what we can do is change the Boolean logic to contains and just replace the entire command line with that string. And we've got an effective means of detecting it. But what we're looking for is if those specific strings are passed on the command line to this process, there was a flaw in how the operating system interpreted that granted the attacker code execution access. Does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Yeah, I was asking because I thought at first it enabled macros and that's why.
Yeah, that's true. Macros would have had to have been enabled. So the user would, and via the phishing attack would have to be sophisticated enough, in this case it was, basically said, this is a Excel file you're going to see that you have to allow the macros, you can trust it, don't worry about it, and they did that. Okay?
If you have more questions, you can
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take any other questions.
anytime.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.